Welcome back to Rich Connections, the podcast where we explore the real, the raw, and the rarely talked about parts of life, the parts that shape who we are, challenge what we believe, and connect us on a deeper level. I'm your host, Stacy Rich. I'm a life and business strategist who loves challenging our thoughts and rebelling against the norm. And today's conversation is one that I have been processing for the last few years, and I'm so excited to talk about it. It won't be the last because I think a lot of us have slowly lost ourselves in the process of becoming adults. Not because we're bad people and not because life went horribly wrong anywhere, but along the way, many of us have learned that being expressive was unsafe. Hear me out. I think we determined that being emotional was embarrassing and joy is immaturity and crying you look weak or dancing is, I don't know, cringy. Passion needed to be controlled somehow and the composure mattered more than aliveness. And I think a lot of people walking around today are not actually emotionally regulated. I think they're emotionally restrained or unhinged but from attempting to control their emotions. So today I want to talk about expression, not just expression as a whole, but emotional expression, physical, cultural, spiritual, and sexual. The body needs to move, the cost of suppressing ourselves, and how maybe healing isn't becoming more composed. Maybe it's becoming more honest. So let's dive in. You know what's interesting? Children express constantly. They laugh loudly and boldly. They cry wholeheartedly, doesn't matter where they are, whether it be like in a church, a library, or a restaurant. They don't care. They'll dance randomly, they'll yell and sing, and they even ask questions whenever they have a question. They don't care if it's stupid. They move their bodies naturally, and they don't sit there calculating whether they look sophisticated while they're feeling joy. But adults, on the other hand, somewhere along the way, we've changed. I've been thinking about this lately, and I was thinking about who I used to be as a child. I was expressive. I know I was joyful and goofy and emotional. I was energetic too, and I felt things deeply. I mean, I cried about everything. And I remember over time slowly becoming more aware of how I was being perceived and getting made fun of for those things in different occasions as I got older. So I was determined to not express my emotions so I wasn't portrayed as weak. I didn't want to look immature or too emotional. I wanted to appear collected, put together, sophisticated, and even professional. And I think, especially as women, we receive a lot of messages around who we're allowed to be emotionally. Don't be dramatic or loud, etc. And if you cry too much, you're too sensitive, and don't take up too much space either, or don't be too excited. I remember thinking if I was full of joy, like I seemed ditzy, and even happiness can start to feel embarrassing too. Have you ever noticed that? Like as adults, most almost apologize for joy. People will literally shrink their excitement to avoid judgment. Like, what is playing it cool even? What is that? And why do we do that? Like, where did it come from? I think over time many people become less alive in the name of becoming more acceptable. One thing that really stood out to me, which started this podcast to go ahead and come into fruition, was on the other day I went to church with a friend, and it was predominantly a Black church. And when you walk in, you immediately feel the energy in the room. Everyone is so kind and engaging and expressive, and people are dancing, clapping, singing loudly, moving their bodies to whatever feels good to them. They're expressing their emotions outwardly, and you could feel the joy. You could feel them surrendering, and you could feel the passion. Every time I go, I analyze this thought about, why do I feel so uncomfortable about expressing myself too? It's not like I'm against expressing. I love it. I love watching people express themselves. So why do I do this? Why can't I openly surrender like most of the people in the room? And it made me realize how differently human beings are taught to express emotion and spirituality. Because then you walk into some other churches, many predominantly white churches, for example, and and the environment is often calmer and quieter and more reserved, or even routine maybe. But people may feel deeply, but they express it differently. And what fascinated me was realizing that emotional expression is heavily shaped by culture, family systems, environment, and what we've been taught is appropriate, in addition to how secure we feel with ourselves. And psychologists actually call this display rules. Display rules are basically the social rules we learn growing up about what emotions are accessible or acceptable, and how much emotion, how we should express them, and if we should. And then research also showed that different cultures socialize emotional expressions very differently. Some cultures encourage outward expression, and then while others value emotional restraint, some emphasize emotional harmony and composure. Others encourage passionate emotional release. But what comes interesting is how deeply those rules get internalized, because eventually they stop feeling like learned behavior. They start feeling like identity. You know what I mean? Honestly, once I started paying attention to it, I began noticing it everywhere, not just in churches. And you can see it across cultures all over the world, and how people celebrate, grieve, communicate, and even move their bodies. There are cultures where people naturally speak with their hands, where conversations are loud and layered and emotional, where people interrupt each other not out of disrespect, but because passion and engagement are part of connection. Then there are cultures where emotional restraint is considered respectful and composed and mature, and where maintaining harmony and calmness is deeply valued. Even grief looks different depending on where you are in the world. In some cultures, grief is incredibly outward. People cry loudly, they wail, gather together for days and cook together, sing together, physically hold each other even, and publicly express it. And then there's other countries or other cultures. And then in other cultures, grief is quieter and more internalized, more strength, where strength is shown through composure and privacy. And what's interesting is that humans tend to normalize whatever emotional environment they were raised in. We rarely stop to ask ourselves, is this actually who I am emotionally, or is this simply what I learned was acceptable? And I think about places where dancing is just woven into life, like not as performance, not as content for social media or choreography to impress people, but as actual expression. Families dancing as gatherings, and older generations dancing with younger generations, music being a part of connection instead of something people quietly consume while sitting still. And then I look at so many adults now who genuinely feel uncomfortable moving their bodies in front of people unless alcohol is involved first. That says a lot. I think many of us have become so hyper aware of ourselves that we struggle to simply experience ourselves. Even things like joy can become monitored. You see people hold back excitement because they don't want to look childish. You see people minimize their laughter because they don't want to cause attention on themselves. You see people emotionally flatten themselves in professional environments because they want to appear intelligent or emotionally controlled. That was me. Anytime when I worked for other people, anytime I was talking to a boss or something like that, I would always like get emotional, and I'm like, I would get so mad at myself for getting emotional. Like, why am I crying? And, I worked on it to try to become more emotionally controlled and look intelligent. And again, I'm not saying every culture should express emotion in this exact same way, because I actually think there's beauty in different forms of expression. There's beauty in reverence, there's beauty in passion, there's beauty in calmness, even, and there's beauty even in openness. Okay. But I do think many people have disconnected from what is natural for them personally because they become more focused on social acceptance and honest expression, which is what I'm trying to get at. And over time, when you continuously override natural emotional expression, I think you slowly stop feeling fully alive in your body. Before, I honestly think adulthood rewards performance more than authenticity most of the time. I mean, think about it. The people who are praised are often the people who stay composed and kept together and don't make others feel uncomfortable and just remain productive and polished all the time, or just remain emotionally controlled, right? I mean, meanwhile, many people are privately anxious. They're depressed or numb, disconnected, exhausted, or emotionally shut down. And society often calls that maturity. But is it maturity or is it suppression? Because there's a difference. There's a difference between emotional regulation and emotional suppression. Emotional suppression says, I cannot show this. And then regulation says, I can safely feel this without becoming consumed by it, right? That's very different. And I think many adults have learned how to suppress emotion without ever learning how to process emotion. Another thing I've been really thinking about lately is how disconnected many of us have become from our actual bodies, not our appearance or if we're attractive, and not whether we look fit or if we're aging well. But I mean, disconnected from actually feeling ourselves because most adults live almost entirely from the neck up. We live in our thoughts, our schedules, stress, responsibilities, our phones, our performances, and our image or productivity. And meanwhile, the body's over here carrying everything we refuse to process. I think there are people whose bodies have been in survival mode for so long that they don't even remember what it's like to feel relaxed or open, sensual, expressive, safe, or emotionally free. And I think the body communicates constantly. And it communicates through tension, exhaustion, tightness in your chest and your neck, stomach issues, headaches, shallow breathing, jaw clenching, your nervous system dysregulation, fatigue, and then numbness. Your body is always talking. And what's interesting is that when you watch people who are truly expressive, you'll notice they're usually in their bodies. They're not over monitoring themselves every second. They're allowing themselves to express the moment instead of, or they're allowing themselves to experience the moment instead of constantly managing how they're being perceived within the moment. I think about myself when I'm at concerts. I do this all the time. I just want to dance, and sometimes my body moves before my brain gets in the way. And I start analyzing, oh my gosh, what if people are looking at me? So then I start calculating if I'm going to dance or how I'm going to dance. And then I'm like, well, I want to look like I don't care. So then I'll start dancing, but that's calculated dancing. And then I just go in this cycle and I would just give anything to just freely dance. And sometimes I can, but sometimes, a lot of times I can't. And I think that's one of the reasons movement can feel so emotional for people. Have you ever noticed how sometimes music hits you and your body almost wants to respond before your mind does? Like your foot starts moving and you start dancing and you're like, oh shit. And then you start singing and you're like, kind of get lost. And sometimes you even want to cry. And then immediately the mind jumps in and it's like, how do I look? This is awkward. Don't be weird. Calm down. Act normal. And just like that, the body gets interrupted again. I honestly think many adults are chronically interrupting themselves. Like interrupting their expression, you know what I mean? Like interrupting your laughter, your tears, your excitement. I mean, think about how many times where you're like, oh, you try to stop yourself from crying in front of someone, or you're angry but you don't want to express it. And like think about creativity too. Like you want to be creative but you don't. Or like if you're in brainstorming situation and you're too afraid to bring up your creative piece to bring into the equation, and then even like interrupting your sensuality. And then eventually that interruption becomes so automatic that people don't even realize they're doing it anymore. And one thing trauma experts talk about a lot is how animals naturally discharge stress after a threatening experience, and I think we can learn from them. You'll literally see animals shake after danger passes because their bodies are completing the stress response cycle physically and naturally. And I think about like when my dogs are playing, they'll shake after they're done, like because they're releasing the energy and shifting. And then like humans on the other hand, often interrupt that process. Instead of allowing ourselves to fully process what we feel, we tend to push through it and distract ourselves, stay busy or numb ourselves with work or alcohol, social media, constant stimulation, and convince ourselves we're fine because we've learned how to function while carrying stress. But functioning and processing are not the same. I think a lot of people have become incredibly high functioning while still being deeply disconnected from themselves emotionally and physically. Their bodies carrying tension that never got released, grief that never gets acknowledged, and anger that never expressed, and exhaustion that has built over years, constantly overriding what we actually feel. And then eventually the body starts actually asking for attention in other ways, like anxiety, burnout, chronic tension, emotional numbness. You don't feel full alive. You're getting through life, but you're not really experiencing it deeply. That's why I think movement can incredibly be healing, not because dancing or movement magically solves all your problems, but because for a moment you are stopping micromanaging yourself. You stop um, trying to appear composed and you allow your body to participate in life again instead of just carrying the weight of it. And honestly, I think many adults are starving for that and that feeling without even realizing it. They miss feeling free in their own bodies. They miss laughing without restraint. Like, what would that be like? I miss moving without self consciousness and feeling emotional, like emotionally, and then just feeling emotionally open instead of emotionally managed all the time. I think there's something deeply healing about allowing ourselves to feel fully without immediately trying to control, minimize, or judge the experience. And I think that's part of why so many people feel emotionally heavy, even when nothing is technically wrong. And this is also why things like dancing, breath work, exercise, singing, crying, whatever, laughing deeply, somatic therapy, and even screaming into a pillow can create such profound emotional release, not because those things are magical in any way, but because the body is finally being allowed to finish what it's been trying to do all along. And I think there's a level of freedom that comes when your body no longer feels like a prison for all the things you've never allowed yourself to feel. I know that's heavy words, but it is essentially being caged. This isn't just emotional or spiritual either, guys. There's actual research behind this. A psychologist did studies on emotional suppression and found that suppressing emotional act actually increases physiological stress responses in your body. So outwardly you may appear calm, but internally your body is still activated. And studies have linked chronic emotional suppression with anxiety, depression, increased cortisol, our cardiovascular strain, nervous system dysregulation, and weakened immune functioning. And honestly, I think many people's bodies are carrying emotions their mouths never allow them to express. I think there are people walking around carrying years of grief, anger, heartbreak, fear, shame, loneliness, and disappointment all inside of us because they've learned that expression is unsafe. Many people build identities around being the composed one. I think about my grandmother who is so poised, and I never saw her get out of line with her emotions. I say get out of line, but express herself. I think very rarely saw it. I think maybe one of the first times I really saw her shed tears was at my grandmother or my mother's funeral, and then I saw her express herself, um, at when my grandfather was in the hospital and she got a phone call from the doctor, I walked in on her, crying uncontrollably, but that wasn't even like me being there and she knew I was there. She was crying in her own privacy, not realizing that I was there. But she was always so composed and, you know, she was the strong, rational, mature, emotionally controlled one. And I understand it because I've learned that. I think, you become the person you always that looks okay, you always sound okay or who always appears fine, but internally you start disconnecting from your own emotional aliveness. And the weird thing is, people often praise you for it. Like I get compliments all the time about being composed while you're internally falling apart. That's wild when you think about it, you know? Okay. This is where I want to bring in the untethered soul. This book is was a game changer for me. I found it when my mom passed away. I was looking for a book to help me process and understand the grief that I was having. I couldn't find anything out there, and I'm sorry for whoever recommended this book or however I found it. I know I saw it on the Oprah show or through Oprah, but I don't know. But one of the main ideas Michael Singer, the author, talks about in the book is that life is constantly moving through us in forms of experiences, emotions, energy, discomfort, joy, pain, all of it. And instead of allowing those experiences to pass through naturally, humans tend to clamp down around them. We resist uncomfortable emotions, hold on to painful experiences, build walls around our hearts and create emotional blockages without even realizing it. He explains that every time we suppress something emotionally instead of processing it, it's almost like storing it inside ourselves. Over time, people become emotionally armored. They stop feeling fully because they're trying to project them or protect themselves from discomfort, rejection, heartbreak, vulnerability, or loss of control. What really stood out to me about the book is this idea that freedom doesn't come from controlling life perfectly. It comes from allowing yourself to experience life without constantly closing yourself off from it. And honestly, I think a lot of people are exhausted because they've spent years tightening themselves emotionally instead of allowing themselves to feel, release, and move through experiences naturally. And when experiences happen that we resist, suppress, or cling to, that energy gets stuck. And that's what he talks about. Now, whether someone views this spiritually, emotionally, physiologically, or psychologically, I actually think there's truth to it from multiple angles. You can literally feel when someone is emotionally armored. You can feel guardedness, like tightness or closure, protection. And I think many people are walking around with closed hearts because somewhere along the way, they decided it was safer not to feel fully anymore. And when people hear heart chakra, which he talks about a lot in the book, sometimes they immediately tune out and because it sounds too spiritual. But honestly, if you remove the language for a second, what is a closed heart? It's guardedness, emotional protection, fear of vulnerability, fear of pain, and fear of openness. Okay. So that exists whether someone believes in chakras or not. And I think many people have become so focused on protecting themselves that they no longer feel fully alive. Another area where I think people deeply suppress themselves but rarely talk about honestly is intimate and sexual expression. This is where it all actually started for me is understanding sexual expression and learning the things that I had to go through, which is actually where this podcast sort of stemmed from. And I don't even just mean sex itself. I mean sensuality, desire, attraction, playfulness, physical affection, confidence in your body, emotional openness, like flirtation, feeling connected to yourself as a human being with wants and needs and energy all together. And I think a lot of people become disconnected from that part of themselves too. And again, so much of it comes back to conditioning, depending on someone who, depending on someone, how someone was raised. Intimacy may have been associated with shame, danger, guilt, immorality, weakness, loss of control, religion, fear of judgment. But some people grew up in homes where affection wasn't shown at all. I know my grandparents never said I love you to my dad. I actually got them saying I love you all the time because I would say it to them, and they eventually started saying it, but I never heard them say it to him. And some people were taught that sexuality should be hidden or suppressed. Some people were sexualized too early and learned to disconnect from their body for protection. Others learned that they had value primarily because of sexuality and not because of emotional connection. So people end up carrying all these complicated narratives around expression and intimacy without realizing how much those beliefs are shaping their lives. And I think, especially for women, there are so many conflicting messages. You're expected to be attractive, but not too attractive because then you're sexual. You're too sexual. Or confident, but not intimidating. Sensual, but still respectful, expressive, but not too much, desired, but not fully free in your desire. It creates this constant internal monitoring where many women are simultaneously taught to use their beauty while also being judged for embodying it too openly. And over time, I think many people disconnect from genuine intimacy because they spent so much time performing versions of themselves instead of actually feeling safe enough to fully express themselves emotionally and physically. There's actual research supporting the connection between suppression and sexual well being, too. Studies published finding that chronic stress, emotional stress, shame, and anxiety can negatively impact sexual well being, desire, body connection, and intimacy. Researchers also have found that emotional safety and nervous system regulation can play a major role in healthy intimacy because the body struggles to fully relax and connect when it's operating from stress or hypervigilance. And honestly, that makes complete sense to me because intimacy requires presence and it requires openness. Like, can you just for a second with me? Like, when you're in the bedroom with your spouse or your loved one or whoever, like, how open are you in your sexual environment? How open are you in being intimate? Like, what does that look like? Are you performing or are you open? And I know this is uncomfortable to talk about, but I really want to have these conversations. It requires being in your body instead of disconnected from it, is what I'm getting at. But many people are carrying years of emotional armor into their relationships, and I also think there's a huge difference between sexuality as performance and sexuality as expression. A lot of modern culture has made sexuality incredibly performative. People are constantly consuming images of what attractiveness is supposed to look like, how intimacy is supposed to happen, how bodies are supposed to move, how people are supposed to act. And I think many people have become disconnected from what authentic connection actually feels like. They're aware of themselves instead of present with themselves. Does that make sense? And I think that same self-monitoring we talked about earlier shows up here too. People are worried about how they look, their how they sound, whether they're desirable enough or whether they're doing things right instead of actually feeling connected, expressive, relaxed, playful, safe, and emotionally open. To me, healthy sexual or intimate expression isn't about being wild or inappropriate or overly provocative. It's about feeling connected to yourself without shame. It's about being able to experience closeness, affection, desire, sensuality, and emotional openness without feeling like you have to suppress parts of yourself to remain acceptable. Because I honestly think that many adults are craving deep connection while simultaneously being terrified of true vulnerability. And vulnerability is expression too, and connection is all of that. I had a friend that went to another country, and I remember her telling me about it, and she was like, people were dancing constantly at gatherings. It wasn't professional or performative. It was just natural for them. Like children, grandparents, all types walk of life were dancing. They laughed loudly, cried, and hugged fully. And they said that what shocked them the most wasn't the expressiveness from those people. It was realizing that how emotionally restrained Americans often are by comparison, how self-conscious and how image conscious we are, how calculated we have become. Now, I think that social media has really amplified this. Now people don't just experience moments, they evaluate themselves while experiencing the moment. You know what I mean? Like, how do I look? Am I weird? Am I embarrassing? Am I too much? Does my hair look okay? And that constant self-monitoring disconnects people from genuine expression. I think many people imagine healing looking perfectly calm all the time, but healing is messy. And sometimes it's just like crying whenever, laughing whenever, like a stupid shit, dancing in the kitchen because you need to just get it out and have a good moment, like while you're cooking, saying what you really feel to people going forward and creating art. When's the last time you created something just out of joy? And then moving your body, feeling passionate again and just reconnecting to the joy. Like that's all what healing looks like. And maybe healing isn't becoming emotionally numb. Maybe it's becoming emotionally safe enough to feel again. So ask yourself this question. When was the last time you danced without caring what you looked like? I couldn't tell you personally. When was the last time you cried, allowed yourself to cry fully or laugh or just sing loudly in the car, not caring about the tone and expressing yourself without like shrinking and allowed yourself to feel your body? And maybe the bigger question is, who did you become in order to be accepted? And is that version of you actually healthy or just socially rewarded? I really believe expression is a part of being human, not reckless emotional dumping or chaos or losing control, but honest expression like movement, feeling, joy, release, and just connection all around. And maybe some of us don't need to become more polished. Maybe we need to become more alive again, authentically. Maybe there's a version of you underneath all of the conditioning that still wants to dance in the rain like me. And if this episode moved you, share it with a friend, please. Leave a review, tag me on socials. Let's spread this message because the world needs more people living richly and honestly. So until next time, Rich Rebels, rebel, root, and rise intentionally so you can also live richly. See you next time.